Everyone in the office feared the ruthless millionaire CEO until a cashier dared to speak the unthinkable. The building of Harrison Enterprises towered over the city like a monument to power, its glass windows reflecting the gray morning sky. Inside, employees hurried through the lobby with their eyes down, their steps brisk, the air heavy with tension that never seemed to lift. Everyone knew that at the top of this empire was Michael Harrison, the 35-year-old CEO who had built his fortune with relentless discipline and an iron will. Stories about his temper traveled faster than the elevators, whispered in hallways and break rooms. He had fired managers in front of their teams, shredded contracts in board meetings, and reduced ambitious executives to silence with nothing more than a single sharp look. To outsiders, he was brilliant, magnetic, the embodiment of success. To those who worked under him, he was a storm contained in a tailored suit. Michael had grown used to this atmosphere of fear. He believed it kept people sharp, efficient, hungry. It was the same philosophy that had driven him from a childhood of scarcity to an empire of millions. Yet for all his power, his gaze carried a weight that made others shrink. His dark brown eyes, always alert, seemed to measure and dissect, leaving no room for comfort. His presence in a room was like a command in itself. One didn't speak unless invited, one didn't breathe too loudly. On the lower floors, far from the boardrooms and private offices where decisions worth millions were made, Sarah Miller adjusted her apron behind the counter of the corporate cafeteria. She had started this job only a few months earlier, grateful for the steady paycheck, even if it came with long hours on her feet and little recognition. At 28, she carried the weariness of someone older. Her mother's health bills were stacked on the kitchen table of their small apartment, her savings nearly non-existent, her future uncertain. Still, Sarah smiled at every customer, greeted them warmly, and performed her job with quiet diligence. Unlike the executives around her, she didn't have the luxury of fear. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Sarah had heard the stories about Michael Harrison long before she saw him in person. Everyone had. She overheard employees whispering about his merciless critiques and his perfectionist standards. Once, a secretary had told her in hushed tones that she had seen him fire an entire team after a single failed pitch. Sarah had laughed nervously, not knowing if it was truth or myth, but the look in the woman's eyes told her it was more fact than rumor. On most days, Michael never came to the cafeteria himself. He had assistants, aides, interns, people who fetched his meals, his coffee, whatever he wanted before he even asked. But every so often, without warning, he appeared, and the energy in the room shifted instantly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, hands stilled over trays, and the entire line stiffened as if facing inspection. That morning, Sarah felt it before she even saw him. The cafeteria, usually filled with chatter and the clatter of dishes, went silent in an unnatural way. She glanced up and saw him walk through the entrance, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair perfectly in place, his expression set in the stern mask that seemed to be carved onto his features. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like armor, his stride confident, purposeful. The employees parted instinctively, giving him a clear path to the counter. Sarah's pulse quickened as he approached. She had never served him before, but she knew what he represented to everyone else. Authority, intimidation, power wrapped in human form. She tightened her grip on the register, willing her hands not to tremble. This was just another customer, she told herself. Just another order. But when Michael Harrison reached the counter, he didn't look at her. He tossed his card onto the tray with the practiced indifference of a man who expected the world to move at his command. His voice was curt, cutting through the silence of the room. Faster. I don't have time for your mistakes. The words weren't shouted, but they might as well have been. They sliced through the cafeteria, drawing every eye to the young cashier standing across from him. The air was thick with anticipation, the staff and employees frozen in place, waiting for her to shrink back, to stammer an apology, to hurry as everyone else always did in his presence. But Sarah, standing there with the weight of her own struggles pressing on her shoulders, felt something stir inside her. She was tired of fear, tired of people like him treating the world as if it belonged to them. For the first time, she looked up fully, meeting the piercing brown eyes that had cowed an entire company. And though her hands still trembled, her voice found its strength. This moment, though neither of them knew it yet, would change everything. Sarah's fingers hovered over the register, the small plastic card resting between them and the man who commanded an empire. The silence of the cafeteria pressed in on her, every pair of eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to crumble under the weight of Michael Harrison's authority. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, rapid and insistent, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of choosing what came next. For a moment, the easy path called to her. Lower her head, apologize, ring up the order as quickly as possible, and let him walk away with his dominance intact. It was what everyone else did. It was what kept them safe. But something inside Sarah rebelled. Maybe it was exhaustion from months of balancing two jobs, nights spent worrying over hospital bills, mornings where she had to remind herself to smile even when her chest ached with the weight of it all. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's voice, urging her never to let anyone treat her as less than she was worth. Or maybe it was simply the sight of him, this man, untouchable, towering over her, expecting obedience like it was his birthright. Whatever the reason, she felt her spine straighten, her chin lift, and words rose to her lips before fear could silence them. "Sir," she said clearly, her voice steady, though her stomach nodded. "Everyone treats you like you're a king, but here you're just another customer, and you'll wait your turn like everyone else." The words seemed to hang in the air, sharp and undeniable. A ripple went through the cafeteria, not of sound, but of stunned disbelief. Forks froze halfway to mouths, coffee cups lingered in midair. A young intern near the back let out an audible gasp before slapping a hand over her mouth. No one, no one, spoke to Michael Harrison like that. Michael's head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Sarah's with a heat that could have burned through steel. For years, he had lived in a world where his power was unquestioned, where silence and fear followed his every step. To be challenged here, in his own company, by a woman in an apron behind a register, was unthinkable. His jaw tightened, the muscle ticking as though he were restraining an instinctive response. Sarah felt her throat tighten under his gaze, but she refused to look away. She had already spoken. Retreat now would be worse than silence. She steadied herself on the counter, her eyes unflinching. For the first time, the balance of power shifted, even if only slightly, and she held her ground. The silence stretched unbearably long. Michael could have fired her on the spot. Everyone knew he had done worse for less. The thought flickered in her mind, but she pushed it aside. If she was going to lose her job, it would be with dignity. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of unleashing the fury everyone anticipated, Michael's lips curved into the faintest, most unreadable smile. It wasn't amusement exactly, but it wasn't anger either. It was something sharper, something more dangerous. Intrigue. He picked up his card slowly, deliberately, and slipped it back into his pocket. His dark eyes never left hers. "Interesting," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. He didn't raise it, didn't lash out. Just one word, but it carried more weight than a lecture could have. The tension broke slightly, murmurs spreading across the room as he turned and walked away without another word, his long strides cutting through the stunned silence. Employees looked at one another in disbelief, their faces pale, their mouths open. Some whispered that Sarah was finished, that she'd be gone by the end of the day. Others stared at her with something like admiration, as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Sarah's hands shook as she finished the next customer's order, her heart hammering in her chest. She had expected fury, humiliation, maybe even termination on the spot. Instead, she had been met with something she couldn't quite place: curiosity, maybe even respect. And that unsettled her more than his anger ever could. When her shift ended, she walked through the corridors of the building, feeling the eyes of coworkers linger on her, whispering in hushed tones as she passed. She knew the gossip would spread like wildfire. She also knew that this wasn't over. Men like Michael Harrison didn't forget challenges, and deep down, though she hated to admit it, part of her dreaded and strangely anticipated what would come next. Michael had never been challenged in his own company like that before. The words Sarah had thrown at him in the cafeteria replayed in his mind for the rest of the day, sharp and unyielding. "Here, you're just another customer, and you'll wait your turn like everyone else." Most people who crossed him were crushed under the weight of his authority, silenced before their sentences could even finish. But not her. She hadn't wavered, hadn't apologized, hadn't even flinched when his gaze bore down on her. She had stood her ground with the quiet defiance of someone who had nothing left to lose. Back in his glass-walled office overlooking the city, Michael sat at his desk, staring at the endless reports and numbers scrolling across his tablet. But none of it seemed to matter. The empire he had built thrived on discipline and control, yet somehow a cashier, a woman he hadn't even noticed before, had disrupted that control with a single sentence. He told himself it was annoyance, that her words had irritated him, and that was why she lingered in his mind. But deep down, he knew it wasn't irritation. It was something far more dangerous: fascination. For Sarah, the aftermath of that moment was heavier than she expected. The cafeteria buzzed with gossip all day, her co-workers sneaking glances at her as though she had transformed into something entirely new. Some whispered that she was brave, others said she was reckless, and a few warned her in hushed voices that she had signed her own resignation. Sarah tried to shake it off, focusing on her work, but the weight of their stares pressed on her shoulders. She told herself she didn't regret what she had said, and yet, as she lay in bed that night, the fear crept in. Michael Harrison had the power to end her livelihood with a single phone call. What if tomorrow she arrived and her ID card no longer worked at the door? The next day, she walked into work with her head held high, bracing herself for the worst. But her badge scanned green. Her job was intact. No one called her into HR. No termination papers awaited her. It was as if nothing had happened. Yet she felt it in the air. Something had shifted. Michael noticed her again that morning, though she didn't see him. He stood in the corner of the lobby, hidden behind the reflective surface of the glass, watching as she greeted the security guard with a smile and carried her small lunch bag to the elevator that took her to the cafeteria floor. There was no nervousness in her step, no visible regret. She moved with the same calm purpose as before. That quiet resilience intrigued him even more. Throughout the week, he found himself inventing reasons to pass by the cafeteria. Meetings scheduled conveniently around lunchtime, phone calls that required him to walk through the building at just the right hour. Each time he caught glimpses of her, the way she smoothed tensions between impatient employees in line, the way she offered a kind word to a frazzled intern, the way she gave her full attention to every person she served, no matter their rank. What unsettled him most was the realization that he respected it. He had built his empire by demanding efficiency, by rewarding ambition and crushing weakness. But watching Sarah, he saw a different kind of strength, one that didn't shout or intimidate, one that carried itself in quiet dignity and unwavering fairness. It made him question, for the first time in years, whether his own methods had truly earned him respect or only fear. Sarah, meanwhile, began to notice his presence. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, but after the third day in a row of seeing him walk through the cafeteria line, never rushing, never barking orders, just watching, she knew it wasn't chance. His eyes lingered too long, his silence too deliberate. The thought unsettled her. Why would a man like Michael Harrison waste even a second of his time observing someone like her? One afternoon, as she handed change to a secretary, she glanced up and saw him at the far end of the room, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed directly on her. The intensity of it made her pulse quicken. She looked away immediately, forcing herself to focus on the next customer. But she couldn't ignore the flush creeping up her neck. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, her mother sleeping in the next room, the bills spread out in front of her. She pressed her hands to her face, exhaling shakily. She couldn't afford to be distracted by him. He was powerful, dangerous, the kind of man who left wreckage in his wake. Whatever curiosity lingered in his eyes, it was nothing she could allow herself to entertain. She had fought too hard to hold her life together. And yet when she closed her eyes, she saw his expression in the cafeteria. Not angry, not mocking, but intrigued. And that look terrified her more than his fury ever could. The cafeteria was unusually quiet that afternoon, the kind of lull that fell between the breakfast rush and the crowded frenzy of lunch. Sarah wiped down the counter, grateful for a rare moment of calm, her thoughts occupied with the endless list of errands she would have to face after her shift. Picking up her mother's prescription, paying the electricity bill before the late fee, doubled, and somehow finding the strength to prepare dinner despite her aching feet. She was so lost in her routine worries that she didn't notice the figure standing just beyond the counter until the silence sharpened and drew her attention. Michael Harrison stood there, tall and imposing, but without the entourage or assistants that usually hovered around him. He wasn't holding his phone, wasn't tapping at his watch impatiently, wasn't even projecting that usual aura of icy indifference. Instead, he was simply watching her, his dark brown eyes fixed in a way that made her heart stumble. She straightened immediately, bracing herself. Her co-workers nearby stiffened as well, their movements faltering. The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion that usually followed whenever the CEO decided to speak directly to someone. Sarah prepared herself for a reprimand, maybe even the termination she had been expecting since their confrontation days earlier. But instead of cutting her down with harsh words, Michael spoke in a tone that was low, almost conversational. "You handled that customer well," he said, nodding toward the man who had stormed out only moments ago after she calmly diffused his frustration about a billing error. Sarah blinked, taken aback. Compliments were not part of Michael Harrison's reputation. "I was just doing my job," she replied cautiously, her voice steady but cool. He tilted his head, studying her. Most people would have folded under that kind of pressure, or escalated it into something worse. You didn't. The unexpected acknowledgement unsettled her more than anger would have. She tightened her grip on the rag in her hand, needing something solid to ground her. "Like I said, it's my job. People come here tired, stressed, sometimes angry. Someone has to keep things calm." Michael's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something thoughtful. A flicker of amusement, perhaps. "Interesting. That's twice now you've reminded me that not everyone bends the rules for me." Once at the counter, and now again, her pulse quickened. She hadn't expected him to bring it up. "If you came here to intimidate me, it won't work," she said quickly, meeting his gaze head on. "I won't apologize for what I said." For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence felt heavy, charged. Finally, he stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Good. Don't apologize." His eyes locked with hers, unwavering. "Do you know how rare that is? For someone to stand up and not break when I push back? People call me ruthless, Sarah, but they forget. I didn't get here by asking permission to exist. I respect strength when I see it." Her name on his lips made her chest tighten. She hadn't told him, but of course he knew it. He probably knew everything about her now. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. "And what exactly do you want from me, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, forcing herself to keep her tone neutral, though her hands were trembling slightly against the counter. He studied her face for a long moment before answering. "I want to understand you." The words caught her off guard, more unsettling than any threat could have been. Understand her? Why would a man like him, with wealth, power, and influence far beyond anything she could imagine, care to understand a cashier who lived paycheck to paycheck? "You don't need to understand me," she said sharply, her walls shooting back up. "I'm not part of your empire. I'm not a number in your reports. I'm just here to do my shift and go home." That's all. Something flickered in his eyes then, something she couldn't quite read. Frustration, maybe, or admiration. He straightened, his expression slipping back into the mask of the CEO, but there was still an intensity in his gaze that unsettled her. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I don't believe that's all there is to you." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his stride calm and deliberate, leaving her staring after him with her heart pounding. The entire cafeteria, which had fallen silent during their exchange, slowly returned to life with murmurs and nervous chatter. Her co-workers exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering furiously about what they had just witnessed. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the echo of his words. "I want to understand you." She pressed her palms against the counter, trying to steady her breathing. This was dangerous. Whatever curiosity Michael Harrison had about her, she couldn't let herself be pulled into it. He was power, he was wealth, he was danger wrapped in a perfectly cut suit, and she was just trying to survive. And yet, against her will, part of her wondered why his voice had sounded so different when he spoke to her. Not cold, not commanding, but almost human. The tension in the office reached a breaking point only a few days later. Rumors had been spreading all morning like wildfire. Whispers of missing funds, irregularities in the books, and a top manager pointing fingers at the lowest level employees. By noon, the cafeteria, usually alive with chatter and routine complaints about food portions, had turned into a sea of worried faces. Sarah could feel the unease in the air as she rang up orders, her instincts telling her something was about to snap. Her suspicions were confirmed when a group of security officers marched through the cafeteria doors, followed closely by one of the company's senior managers, Mr. Collins, a man whose arrogance and smug grin were as familiar as the sound of his expensive shoes tapping against the tile. He raised his voice for everyone to hear, his words slicing through the room. It's come to my attention that there has been theft within this company. Food, supplies, and cash from registers are unaccounted for. And I believe the problem lies right here, among the cafeteria staff. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Sarah froze, her hand hovering over the register, her chest tightening. Around her, her co-workers looked stricken, some protesting under their breath, others staring at the floor in terrified silence. Collins smirked, clearly relishing the power of his accusation. He gestured toward the line of workers. Effective immediately, several of you will be suspended until we can sort this out. Those responsible will face criminal charges. Sarah's blood boiled. She had seen Collins lurking near the storerooms more than once, his entitled demeanor making her skin crawl. And she knew with a certainty that came from watching too closely that he was lying now. He was scapegoating the cafeteria staff, people who barely made enough to pay rent, to cover his own misconduct. Before she could stop herself, Sarah stepped out from behind the counter, her voice ringing louder than she thought possible. That's not true. The room fell silent again, the hush immediate and absolute. All eyes turned to her. Collins narrowed his gaze, his smile turning cruel. And what exactly do you know, Miss Miller? You think you're in a position to contradict me? Her heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to stand tall. I know you've been in the storerooms after hours. I've seen you taking boxes out the back door. If anyone's been stealing from this company, it's you. Gas rippled through the cafeteria. Collins's face darkened, his confidence faltering for the first time. You'd better watch your mouth, he hissed, his voice low, but there was no mistaking the edge of panic in it. Before he could speak again, a new voice cut through the room, deep and commanding. She doesn't need to watch her mouth. Michael Harrison stood at the entrance, his presence like a thunderclap. The crowd parted instinctively, giving him a clear path as he strode into the cafeteria, his gaze locked on Collins. The manager stammered, his earlier arrogance dissolving under the weight of Michael's stare. She needs to be listened to, Michael continued, his tone sharp. Because while you've been busy making accusations, I've had our auditors review the security footage from the last month. Care to guess what we found? Collins' face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched unbearably until Michael's voice cut it again, calm but lethal. We found you, Collins. Box after box, night after night. You've been stealing from my company while trying to destroy the reputations of the people who actually work with integrity. The entire cafeteria seemed to exhale at once, a collective release of tension. Employees looked at one another in awe, some even smiling with relief. Collins sputtered something incoherent, but it didn't matter. Two security officers stepped forward at Michael's nod, escorting him out as he protested weakly. Michael turned then, his gaze sweeping over the staff and finally resting on Sarah. For a moment, the hard lines of his expression softened, though his voice remained steady. This company was built on discipline, but discipline means nothing without fairness. Today, one of you reminded me of that. His eyes lingered on Sarah, a silent acknowledgement. You have my respect. The word struck her like a jolt. Respect. From Michael Harrison. She felt dozens of eyes shift to her, co-workers staring in open amazement. Heat rushed to her cheeks, but she refused to look away from him. Something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but undeniable. That night, when Sarah returned home, she sank into the worn chair at her kitchen table, her body still trembling from the events of the day. She thought about the way Collins had looked when confronted, the gasps of the staff, the power of standing up and refusing to be silent. And she thought about Michael, the way his voice had cut through the chaos, the way his gaze had locked onto hers as though she were the only person in the room. It terrified her how much that look lingered in her mind. Because for the first time, she realized that Michael Harrison was no longer just the man she had stood up to at the register. He was becoming something far more complicated. The days after the cafeteria scandal moved slowly, like the hush that follows a storm. The staff whispered about Sarah in awed tones, treating her almost like a heroine. For years, no one had dared to speak out against corruption, and yet she had done so publicly, in front of everyone, without flinching. Some looked at her with admiration, others with envy, but all of them knew that something had shifted. She wasn't just the quiet cashier anymore. She was the woman who had stood up to power and won. Sarah, however, didn't feel heroic. She felt exhausted. She hadn't acted to prove anything or to impress anyone. She had spoken because it was right, because she couldn't stomach watching innocent people take the fall for someone else's greed. But now, with the weight of all those stares following her through the halls and cafeteria lines, she wondered if she had invited trouble into her life, especially since Michael Harrison himself had spoken those words about respect. Respect from a man like him wasn't simple. It was a signal, a spotlight, and Sarah knew enough about power to understand that it could burn. Michael had not forgotten the moment either. In his office high above the city, he found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to admit. He had built his reputation on intimidation, on pushing people until they broke, but she didn't break. First at the register, then in front of the entire staff, Sarah Miller had stared him down and revealed a truth no one else had the courage to speak. He admired her for it, though the word admire felt too tame for the restless curiosity she had ignited in him. It wasn't just her defiance that lingered in his mind. It was the way her voice carried a kind of conviction he had almost forgotten existed. He began to see her differently, not as a cashier, not as another nameless employee, but as someone who carried strength that didn't need wealth or power to be real. It unsettled him more than he could admit. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who either feared him or wanted something from him. Sarah was neither, and that made her dangerous. One afternoon, a few days after Colin's downfall, Michael appeared in the cafeteria again. This time, he didn't stride in with his usual aura of authority. He came quietly without his entourage and stood in line like everyone else. The room hushed, as it always did when he entered, but instead of demanding immediate service, he simply waited. Sarah noticed him almost instantly, her stomach tightening with unease. He was watching her again, not with the cold detachment she had grown used to from powerful men, but with something that looked almost human. When he finally reached the counter, she kept her tone professional, her hands steady as she took his order. "What can I get you today, Mr. Harrison?" His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Coffee. Black." Then as she rang it up, he added in a quieter voice, "You were right about Collins. Thank you for speaking up." Her hand faltered on the register for just a second before she recovered. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze evenly. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for the people he was trying to ruin." A flicker of something, amusement, maybe respect again, crossed his face. That's exactly why it mattered. She gave him his coffee without another word, refusing to be drawn in. But when he walked away, she couldn't ignore the strange heat that lingered in her chest. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table again. Bills spread out before her, the weight of responsibility pressing down as always. But her mind kept drifting back to him. The way he had said thank you, the way he had waited in line without complaint, the way his voice had lost its sharp edge when he spoke only to her. She hated that it stayed with her, hated that she wondered if there was more to Michael Harrison than the ruthless man everyone else feared. Michael, on his part, found himself restless. He had always been decisive, always clear about what he wanted and how to get it. But with Sarah, nothing was simple. He couldn't intimidate her, couldn't buy her, couldn't bend her to his will. And for the first time in years, he realized he didn't want to. He didn't want her fear or her obedience. He wanted her honesty. He wanted her to keep looking at him the way she did, as if she could see straight through the armor he wore every day and glimpse the man beneath. The realization unsettled him. Michael Harrison was not a man accustomed to vulnerability, yet every encounter with Sarah left him feeling exposed. And still, he kept coming back. Sarah didn't know it yet, but the walls she had built around herself were beginning to tremble. And Michael didn't know it yet either. But the man he thought he was, the unshakable CEO, the ruthless millionaire, was starting to change. The shift in Michael's behavior was subtle at first, so much so that Sarah thought she was imagining it. He began appearing in the cafeteria more frequently, but never with the arrogance she had once associated with him. He stood in line like everyone else, patient and quiet, never demanding special treatment. The employees whispered about it constantly, their confusion palpable. To them, Michael Harrison was a force of intimidation, a man who cut through red tape with a slash of his pen and a glare that froze blood. To see him waiting for coffee, to see him linger in casual conversation with staff, was nothing short of surreal. For Sarah, it was even more unsettling. She didn't know what game he was playing, but she knew powerful men didn't change overnight. And yet, every time he approached her counter, his words carried none of the sharpness she expected. Sometimes he asked about her day. Sometimes he complimented the efficiency of her coworkers. Once he even cracked a small joke, and though his smile was faint, it caught her completely off guard. One evening, as she wiped down the tables after closing, she looked up to find him standing in the doorway. Her heart lurched, but his posture wasn't one of command. He looked almost hesitant, his hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping the empty room before settling on her. "You shouldn't be doing that alone," he said quietly. "Where are the others?" "They have families," she replied curtly. "Kids to pick up, dinners to make. Someone has to finish the shift." "I don't mind." He walked further into the room, the sound of his shoes echoing in the quiet space. "That's not the point. You do more than your share." "I've seen it." Sarah tightened her grip on the rag, refusing to let his words pierce her armor. "What are you doing here, Mr. Harrison? You don't usually linger after hours." There was a pause before he answered, his tone unusually candid. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being above the rules, about fairness. You were right. I don't hear that often." She blinked at him, startled by the honesty in his voice. "You're not here to tell me I was insubordinate?" A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. "No, I'm here to tell you that you've been reminding me of things I forgot mattered." He took a breath, his gaze holding hers. "I built this company on strength, but somewhere along the way, I confused strength with fear. And you don't fear me. You force me to see myself the way others do. I don't like it, but I need it." The admission struck her harder than anger ever could. She had braced for intimidation, maybe even threats, but not this raw honesty. It made her uneasy because it wasn't the CEO speaking to her now. It was the man beneath the title. She turned back to the tables, her voice clipped. "That's not my responsibility. I didn't say those things to change you. I said them because they were true." "I know," he said, his voice steady. "That's why they matter." For the next several days, Michael's actions spoke louder than any of his words. He ordered changes to scheduling so that cafeteria staff weren't overworked. He insisted on reviewing policies that had long been ignored, making sure lower-level employees had a voice in matters that affected them. It wasn't grand gestures, but small shifts that people noticed. And every time Sarah overheard the whispers, employees marveling at how the CEO was suddenly paying attention to fairness, her chest tightened with something she refused to name. Michael didn't parade his efforts in front of her. He didn't demand acknowledgement. He simply acted. And Sarah, despite herself, began to see him differently. She watched the way his eyes softened when he spoke to janitors, the way he stayed late to hear concerns from departments no one had bothered to consult before. The ruthless edges were still there. This was still Michael Harrison. But there was something new now, something fragile and disarming. One evening, when the cafeteria was nearly empty, Sarah found herself alone at the counter, sorting receipts. Michael appeared again, but this time he didn't speak right away. He simply stood there watching her, until finally she glanced up with an exasperated sigh. "What do you want from me?" He didn't flinch at the sharpness in her voice. Instead, he answered quietly, "I don't want anything from you, Sarah. I just want a chance to show you that I can be more than what I was." Her breath caught, her fingers tightening around the receipts. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell him she didn't care. But the sincerity in his eyes froze the words on her tongue. Instead, she turned away, whispering, "You don't change men like you." "Not really," his reply was immediate, his tone resolute. "Then watch me try." The words lingered in the air long after he left, circling in Sarah's mind like an unwelcome echo. She wanted to hate him, to keep her heart locked against the storm he represented. But the truth gnawed at her. For the first time, she wasn't sure if he was still the man everyone else believed him to be. The end of the week brought with it an unusual tension that Sarah couldn't shake. The cafeteria had returned to its normal rhythm of rushed mornings and loud, crowded afternoons. but she carried a heaviness in her chest, as though something monumental was waiting just out of sight. Every time Michael Harrison walked through those doors, she felt it building. Not the fear that once froze everyone else into silence, but something more complicated, something far more dangerous. That Friday evening, when most employees had already left for the weekend, Sarah stayed behind to close up. The hum of the refrigerators was the only sound, the cafeteria dim under half-lit bulbs. She stacked trays, counted receipts, and tried to convince herself that the restlessness she felt was nothing more than exhaustion. But when the heavy doors swung open behind her, she knew before she even turned who it was. Michael stood there, his jacket draped over one arm, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression stripped of the usual cold precision. He looked tired, almost human in a way that unsettled her more than his commanding presence ever had. She straightened, forcing calm into her voice. "We're closed, Mr. Harrison." He didn't move. "I know. I came to see you." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her face unreadable. "Why?" Michael walked closer, his footsteps deliberate, each one echoing in the silence. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the shadow of vulnerability he didn't bother to hide. "Because I'm done pretending," he said quietly. "You've been forcing me to face myself in ways no one else ever has. And I need you to hear this, whether you want to or not." Sarah froze, the tray still in her hands. "I don't want your speeches. Whatever this is, whatever fascination you think you have with me, it will pass. Men like you don't change. You use people, and when they've served their purpose, you discard them. I won't let myself be one of them." His gaze didn't waver, and his voice carried none of the arrogance she expected. "You're right. That's who I used to be. I built walls so high around myself that I forgot what it meant to live without fear at the center of everything. I thought power was about control, about keeping people at arm's length. But you didn't fear me, and you didn't want anything from me. You told me the truth even when it could have cost you everything. And that's when I realized what I've been missing all these years." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Don't say this now. Don't make this harder. I can't afford to believe you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was almost a plea. "Then don't believe me. Just look at what I've done since that day. I've listened. I've changed policies. I've tried to be the man you accused me of not being. Not for appearances, not for the company, not even for myself. For you. Because I wanted you to see that I could be different." The weight of his words pressed against the fragile walls she had built around her heart. She wanted to argue, to dismiss him, but every memory of the last few weeks flashed in her mind. The way he had waited in line like everyone else, the way he had spoken to staff with genuine respect, the way he had looked at her not as a subordinate, but as an equal. And now, the way he stood before her, not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man stripped of his armor, offering her the one thing she had never expected from him: vulnerability. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You could have anyone. Women who would fall at your feet. Why fixate on me?" Michael's answer was immediate, his tone steady. "Because you're the only one who ever told me the truth. The only one who ever saw me as just a man and not the empire I built around myself. You don't want my money, you don't want my power. You don't even want me, not really. That's exactly why I can't stop wanting you." Her chest tightened painfully, her defenses crumbling under the force of his words. She shook her head, tears threatening to rise. "You don't know what you're asking. I don't have the luxury of risks. My life is too hard, too fragile. If I let myself believe you, and you break me, I won't recover." He moved one step closer, his voice low, raw. "Then let me prove it, Sarah. One chance. That's all I'm asking. One chance to show you that I'm not the man who would break you, that I can be the man who stands beside you." Silence filled the room, heavy and charged, broken only by the faint hum of machines. Sarah stared at him, her heart racing, every instinct warring with the fragile hope she had buried deep. She wanted to push him away, to end this before it could begin, but the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. For the first time, she saw not the CEO, not the millionaire, but a man who was willing to fight for something beyond himself. Finally, with a trembling breath, she whispered, "One chance. That's all you get." Don't make me regret it. Michael's eyes softened, relief flashing across his features. But he didn't reach for her or push further. He simply nodded, his voice steady. I won't. As he left the cafeteria that night, Sarah felt the weight of what she had done settle over her. She had opened a door she never intended to open, but deep down beneath the fear, there was something else too. The faint, flickering light of hope. For Michael Harrison, it was the first time in years he walked away not as a man who had won, but as a man who had been given the chance to begin again. And for Sarah Miller, it was the beginning of something terrifying, uncertain, and impossibly fragile. But maybe, just maybe, something worth the risk. What I love most about this ending is that it refuses to be a fairy tale while still leaving us with hope. Sarah doesn't suddenly forget who Michael was or the fear he created. Her choice to give him one chance is not naive forgiveness. It's an act of bravery. She risks disappointment, she risks heartbreak, but she also chooses to believe in the possibility of change. That in itself is powerful. For Michael, the victory is not that he wins the girl, but that he finally sheds the armor of intimidation and begins to embrace vulnerability. His true transformation isn't in policies or gestures, but in standing in front of Sarah stripped of power and asking for trust, not demanding it. That humility is what makes the ending so striking. The story works because it is about two people who carry scars, one from survival, the other from success, and somehow find a way to bridge the distance between them. The ending reminds us that redemption is messy, fragile, and never guaranteed. But it is possible, and sometimes one chance is all it takes to begin again.